Well, very, very warm welcome. As Sandra and I have been saying as people have been joining us, we're really thrilled that you're here. There are 300 people signed up today for our webinar, so it's brilliant that so many of you have joined us, and we're just going to open with a few housekeeping things before we get underway. So today's session is going to be just this little short introduction with some housekeeping points to help answer some of the questions that you'll have about the links and the slides and that kind of thing. Then we're very, very thrilled to have Benita Hewitt from CUF Research with us, who's going to present some of her work. She's worked with Sandra and the Church of England and lots of different organisations to understand the context of people coming into contact with the church and joining in on faith, starting and joining in on their faith journey. Then Sandra and I are going to have a conversation looking at the way that our work brings two different perhaps perspectives to this idea about helping people, equipping people to start a faith journey. And then we're going to move on to a time of questions and opinions. This is a quip from Nadia Boltz-Weber, who says she doesn't have the answers, but she does have opinions. And Sandra and I are quite good at that, aren't we? So we'll do some questions and opinions. And then we've got a closing prayer liturgy to share with you. So we are asking you if you can send in your questions right from the outset. We've got a team behind the scenes compiling them into themes so that we can get through as many questions as possible. So if you might hear your question, but it might have been slightly rephrased, and I hope you won't take offence at that. It's so that we can combine and compile questions to make sure we get through as many as we can. And Benita will be joining in again with us in that time of questions and opinions. So Sandra, you and I work in slightly different areas, don't we? In the sense of my work is with Fresh Expressions, which tends to be sort of outside of the mainstream of the church, and your work is more to do with the kind of congregation and ministry. Do you want to say a bit about how we started this conversation? Because it's not necessarily an obvious one.
In some ways, it isn't an obvious one, because the work that we do, certainly the work we do around life events, is about those things that the church has always done, where the church has been there for generation upon generation, century upon century, for people with rituals that mark these big three moments in life, which is when a child arrives in a family, when a marriage begins, and of course is very much in our minds recently, is when a life ends. And we just take that for granted as basically the ministry of the church. And of course, all those things happen to people, whether they go to no church, whether they go to a traditional church, or whether they indeed are engaging with a fresh expression. So all of those things are really important moments for people. And over the past more than 7 years, we've worked on life events in particular. We've done a lot of research, and we've realised a lot about the reach that the Church of England has through those moments. Whether that's to a couple or to a family with a young child, or an older family grieving someone they know. And at each of those events that we offer to people, there's not only the people at the heart of the event that we get to have a conversation with, but there's usually a huge number of guests that come. For many of them, it might be the first time they've ever encountered church, when they come to a wedding or a christening, or even when they meet a vicar at a funeral at a crematoria. They might never have met a person like that before. Now, at the moment, the last few months means that all of that fringe contact has disappeared. Now, we calculate that over a year, the Church of England reaches around 15 million people who attend those events, just passing, crossing and meeting with them. And we spent a lot of time in the past few years thinking about just how do we make sure they have a good experience at that moment, and what are some of the things that we've learned can help them make the next step on their faith journey. And now I think we're thinking about how those principles work across a range of different contexts.
And indeed, actually, during this lockdown, we've seen the church adapt very quickly to being online, and we've noticed some experiences of churches growing, if you like, in their congregation, and certainly their reach. People are bumping into church that aren't going to a funeral or a wedding or a baptism, but they're bumping into it online and on Facebook. And also in the terms of Fresh Expressions, that's been something that's been happening longer term anyway, but also the ways that people kind of connecting with people of faith and the pioneer projects has that comes from a very different place, doesn't it? But I think what I'm really fascinated by is I've heard Benita's research, and I know that it really opens up something about how do we enable someone who's bumping into us, however that might come about, to enter into a faith journey, not to just become a church person, but to actually explore some of their own questions and how we might facilitate that. So I think it's probably a good time to hand over to Benita so we can hear that research, and then you and I can kind of have more of a think about that together afterwards.
Yep, great.
Over to you, Benita.
I've been asked to talk in 10 minutes about what research tells us about faith journeys. So here goes. I particularly like this definition by the psychologist Lewis R Rambo, who talks about it being about the dynamic force field that conversions take place in. And he also talks about the influences and the fact that people are influenced by the whole matrix of different factors. So I'm just working on two screens at the moment. It's not right, and that the factors in this process are multiple, interactive, and cumulative. But we're not talking about conversion today. We're talking about faith journeys. And of course, all journeys have a destination, and the destination in the case of a faith journey, I like to think, is to become Christ-like, a Christ-like incarnation of God that few people actually reach. So we're talking about that whole lifetime journey. It's a journey that very much starts in childhood. It's sometimes punctuated by really dramatic moments, and it continues throughout life. But the journey tends to be messy. It's not a straight line that we become a Christian and then it's a sort of very linear path towards becoming Christ-like. People tend to pause in their faith journeys. We sometimes take side trips. We might step backwards, we move forwards. And church is there on that journey, in that dynamic force field and in that matrix of influences. And of course, God is also with us as we journey there. Okay, a brief, although it's complex, I've tried to sort of put it into a simple set of stages here. And today we're going to be very much concentrating on these early parts of this faith journey. So we're talking about starting in that context of people's lives that's ever present, ever changing, ever influencing the faith journey. It's the whole of life, their people's history, their relationships and connections, where they live, their activities, and the church is there often as part of that dynamic force field. As Sandra said, 15 million people interact through life events with the church in most years. Most people are aware of the church, people will have encountered it, and some may have relationships with the church. So that's the context. And we have, in that context of people's lives, we have the opportunity to influence, to change perceptions of church, to make positive memories, to build relationships. And that may lead to some initial engagement, which becomes ongoing engagement, and then some sort of commitment on that journey towards the final transformation. As Sandra said, we are there in that context of people's lives. We've got over 1 million worshippers out there in the world connecting with people. We have 33,000 social action projects, 8 million reached through the Christmas digital campaigns. We have 3 million attending seasonal services. There's all the work done through schools. I think I heard that 15 million people alive today went to a Church of England school. There's somewhere between 35 and 50 million visiting the churches for tourism. So plenty of opportunities to influence people, to connect with people, and to build memories that might influence faith journeys. And I have this quote from an Essex curate who was talking about his toddler group and the work he does with children. He said the whole church supports the toddler group. They're aware of it and hear the stories. We've over 400 children on our books through the weekday childcare. And apart from the primary school and Tesco, we're the next biggest thing in the community, not our Sunday church, but our childcare. And the impact we have on the community because of that is huge. There's a lot of research to show how important building faith in the childhood and early adulthood is. The research from the Church Growth Project showed that people experience little change in their religious belief and practices once they reach their early 20s, and certainly that's confirmed by the research I've done and from much research throughout the world. So we need to concentrate particularly on building good foundations in as people are growing up. So how do we do this? When we enter into that dynamic force field of people's lives, the life events, the toddlers groups, the social action projects, the seasonal services, the schools, how do we actually make the most of that positive make the most to create the positive memory and encourage a faith journey? So it's about if you think of this chart has sort of two axes, and the bottom axis is just doing what we do really, really well. So whether that's a life event or a toddler group or whatever it might be, meeting people's needs and expectations in whatever we are doing, and doing that job really, really well, so on a sort of functional, practical level. But we also need to be working on the other axis, which is also being loving and relational, loving and caring for people, generous hospitality, building relationships. If we do neither of those, we're really on barren ground when it comes to helping people with their faith journeys. But if we do both of those, then we've created fertile ground for the faith journey. There's a quote from someone that was a couple that were having their sort of first talk with a vicar as they were prepared for their wedding. And they said, she made us tea in a teapot with china cups and saucers. It felt quite formal, filling out forms about us, our relationship, why we wanted to marry in a church. And she talked about the marriage preparation classes, what to expect. And we talked about the date. She says, I think she was happy to marry us, but it did feel like an interview where she would decide if we could get married there. And I think that's an example of perhaps of someone that was doing the functional and practical really well, but not really thinking so much about the generous hospitality and loving and caring and building relationships. Or certainly that's the way it came across to the couple. So here is another example from the wedding research we did with couples who had to attend a church in order to get married. These were non-church goers before, at the time of the wedding. And this person, Sarah, said, the vicar and the members of the church were so friendly and welcoming. We wanted to go just because they were so supportive of our decision to marry there. And we've continued to attend as often as possible. And I've since been baptized and been confirmed. And that's an example of sort of showing that love and care for people as they prepare for their wedding. Another example from some research I did for Church Urban Fund, where they're on the functional, practical level, they're providing food for the hungry, shelter for the homeless, sanctuary for the frightened, but they're also, the best ones are also loving and caring, offering that generous hospitality and providing hope. And the two examples that stick in my mind most are an outreach project where people came into the soup kitchen and went to the counter and got a number, and they went sat down, and when their food was ready, which was very basic food, their number was called and they were given they collected their food and sat down and ate it. Absolutely fine on the functional, practical level, but there was another church where people came in and they were greeted, taken to a table that was beautifully laid out with tablecloths, nice cutlery and plates and everything. Someone come to take their order and they were served. And that's an example where they were loving and caring, building relationships and providing hope. Very different. And that provides the best fertile ground for building and developing faith journeys. I was asked, when I was asked to do this piece of this little presentation today, what motivates people? What drives them in their faith journeys? And I would say, as I've said already, that love, an encounter with love, abundant love, is really, really powerful. It sustains people. It's attractive. It sustains people. It transforms people. But what tends to drive people, not just through faith journeys, but through whole of life, is hopes and fears. Bringing a child to baptism is about hope. It's also slightly about fear. Wanting prayer at a funeral is about hope, but there's also some fear. Wanting God to bless a marriage, teaching your children Bible stories is about hope. And so that is a feature throughout all the research that I've done in the secular world too. It's about hopes and fears driving us through life. I was asked what the barriers are to faith journeys, and I think the perception of church is one of the biggest barriers. It's often dismissed as irrelevant because ordinary people aren't religious. Modern life's about working it out for myself, not being told what to think or believe. It's about being spiritual, whereas church is about obedience and dogma and that sort of thing. And church is not seen so much as a place by people who are not connected to church. Church is often seen as not a place to encounter love, not particularly a place to encounter hope, but a place to perhaps be feared. And this we came across this in our research. When we were talking to people, what was it like to go to church for the first time? And they said, well, it was like going to school. I was incredibly nervous. I thought that people would be staring at us. We didn't know what to expect because I hadn't been to church since I was in primary school. I thought would be people looking at us, and we had to look for clues because we didn't know what we were doing. So it can be quite a scary experience. And the thing that people talk about, they fear most of all, is communion. I always feel awkward at communion. People were saying, I'm not sure if we should go to the front because I'm not confirmed, and if you sit down it's really obvious. And somebody else said, my worst memory is during communion. I found the whole thing just a little bit awkward. As I just sit on my own, everyone else gets up. You do feel a little bit like a sore thumb. So to nurture faith, I think we need to do the functional and practical really well, and the loving relational, and then we have fertile ground on which to nurture faith. Now, I've come across this quite a lot in the research, where people are ready to start engaging at this point in their first faith journey, and the church does not help nurture their faith at the time. There was a young mother who, after her child was baptized, she started praying for the first time, but with no support from the church at all, no help from the church. And I said, well, why didn't, she says, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to pray. I said, well, if you talk to the church about it. She says, well, I didn't think to talk to the church. They haven't communicated with me since the baptism. There was another lady who started reading her child Bible stories, but again, without any support from the church. I encountered people in soup kitchens who have a faith, and they talk about faith amongst themselves, but the church doesn't talk about faith with them. Or the wedding couple that said to me, is the church going to talk to us about our faith or not as we prepare for our wedding in the church? So it's really important to intentionally nurture faith. Particularly once you've got that fertile ground, be intentional, take every opportunity, make it about the whole of their lives, and use different styles. Now, thinking about whole life, I particularly like this chart that I saw from Nigel Genders, where he talked about, he said that young people's faith development is more likely to happen and be sustained if it happens in these intersections between school, church and home. So it becomes not just about what the church is doing, but let's say what's the whole of life, what's happening in your life, whether it's at home, church or school. And I think the same can be said for all the adult work that I've done. When faith becomes real and happens in your everyday life, it's more likely to develop. It's particularly important to nurture faith in the home. There was a project that I did for Care for the Family, where we looked at nurturing faith in the home, and these things, just a brief summary of the project at the end of that project. We found for nurturing faith in the home, it's important that God became the centre of everyday family life. Children developed their own relationship. Prayer was encouraged. Families were encouraged to talk about God in the home. We nurture the faith of the whole family, not just the child. We give parents the confidence to nurture faith in their children, and that those families are supported. So really important part of faith development is nurturing faith in the home. Something else that's important in faith journeys is there's often a catalyst. So the church is there, you've got the fertile ground, and there's a catalyst that makes them want to engage with faith. Now these catalysts can be anything. They're often crises, personal, local, national, international. At the moment, coronavirus would be a time when people are sort of beginning to think about what the meaning of life and what matters, and they might be turning to God. Life events, particularly birth and death, and any major life change like starting school, leaving home, marriage, new job, redundancy in health. And we know that people, sorry, I haven't turned that chart over. We know that people turn to God through prayer. 51% of the population pray, 31% believe in angels, 29% believe they've got a guardian angel. But if we want to, they're more likely to turn to your church if you've created that fertile ground, if you've been in the context and in the dynamic force field of their life. If the church is there and you've been loving and created good relationships with them and created that fertile ground, when they have this time where they're at the greatest hopes or the greatest fears, they're more likely to turn to the church at that point. And when it comes to nurturing faith, I won't go into this in great detail, but there are three ways of doing that. The relational is important, and community, small groups praying together. There's experiential. Some people prefer festivals, events, the church, prayer, social action, and there's intellectual. People tend to favour one or other of these. Some people it's about self-motivated, isolated study, private prayer. CV Digital works really well here. It's obviously good to have all three, but remember, don't just do one of those three styles, because some people will have a preference for one style or the other. So I'm summarising now, because I've realised I've finished about to come to the end of more than the end of my 10 minutes. In summary, create fertile ground and then intentionally nurture. Be in the context of people's lives and be incarnational, meet people's needs, loving people, building relationships. And when you've got that fertile ground, make sure you're intentional about nurturing faith, and be patient, because it does take a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Benita. That was brilliant. Thank you. And Sandra's back with me now as well. So thank you, Benita. We'll be coming back to you once we just get to the questions and opinions section. So if you've got questions on some of the things that Benita's been sharing, do start sending them in. And as Sandra and I talk, please do keep sending those questions in, because our team will be able to then compile and make sure that we get to as many as possible. So Sandra, I know you're particularly familiar with the research, having commissioned some of it yourself, and you know, I know that it's shaped your work. I think some of the reflections I've had in terms of how pertinent it is to fresh expressions and the work that kind of pioneers are doing is often they're encountering people for whom the church isn't part of their context at all, that it hasn't kind of come into their radar, as it were, and it's not part of that matrix that Benita's talking about. Or sometimes, sadly, they've had a negative experience and then that's kind of driven them further away from the church. And sometimes just because there's generations of people that haven't had contact. We're now into, you know, perhaps the third generation where there's not any knowledge of the Bible stories or any kind of living memory of church. And I think that's really significant, isn't it, when you're talking about building positive memories at these really key opportunities, you know, that's really such a key part of it, I think. And that's where pioneers come in for us in terms of reaching those people for whom they haven't had a chance to make those positive memories. But I know that, you know, in terms of that functional and relational stuff, you can see that those life events can really influence and give a good experience and build memories, as it were. So I don't know whether you've got any good examples of where you've seen that happen well.
I think it's really interesting hearing it all again, because I always think of new things of how this works and how we see it functioning in different ways. I think just building on what you've said about perhaps with fresh expressions, finding people who maybe haven't or have had very little awareness of church. One of the things I always encourage people to do is to find out what awareness they have got. We're often not very good as the church at respecting the tangential contact people have had. So we meet a couple say, oh, you'd like to have my baby christened, and you think, oh, well, they've never seen them, they've never been to church before. But then you need to ask them, you know, and ask them if they've been to a wedding. You know, actually, oh yeah, we went to my friend's wedding, it was really good. Or they might say it was really horrible. We have to bear that in mind. A funeral, I mean, I've been brought up short myself with that, by asking people that and realising it was the funeral that they'd met someone who had mitigated God's love and care to them. So we just have to sometimes think more widely about what the context and where church might have just even tangentially been in the context of people's lives without being there in a big way. And I think a lot of what we do here is build that sort of bridge to what's going on in people's lives, whether we meet them in a traditional way or whether we meet them in a fresh expression. We're just thinking of the little contacts and connections that we can make with the life that people live. And when we started the work we do about welcome, we talked a lot about just putting ourselves in their shoes, thinking what it feels like for them. We're often startled when we realise people are afraid of us as the church, like Benita said. Oh, we're such lovely people, aren't we? But when we ourselves think of those contexts we've been in, that really unfamiliar, how scared we often are to even step over the door. And one of the interesting things with this digital thing is, I think, is the way in which people can be more anonymous and just drop in and out a little bit more than they could in a physical building.
When I do mission training with people, sometimes I have in the past given them all £1 and told them to go and put a bet on at the local bookies. And of course that kind of freaks people out. They go and then they come back and I say, well, how was it? And they're like, well, it was terrifying. We walked in, everyone's turned to stare. It was clear I didn't know where I was going, what I was doing. I didn't understand what odds on meant, what, you know, each way, all of those things. And I felt like a fool and I just wanted to get out of there. And then, I mean, the obvious parallel is, well, actually, that's how a lot of people feel about church. So it's kind of like you say, putting yourself in their shoes and understanding for me, I think one of the things is language is so important, and a lot of the pioneer and fresh expressions work is somehow about trying to inhabit the language that people use every day and making that sort of worship and prayer be a much more everyday language things. Obviously, Mercy Church is fantastic at that in terms of being able to put that in language that parents and children can both use, and those kind of examples. And I think some of that is having an awareness that sometimes the language we use just comes across as basically alien, so alien that it really puts people off, or it can do.
That's really interesting, Heather, because one of the things I've been observing is language around notices that are going up at the moment everywhere about places as places reopen. And I observed in the high street that there were 4 key words that get used, and it so fits in with what Benita was saying about warmth and hospitality and function and process, because the 4 key words that I see on the high street and in order are welcome, delight, together, safe. Now, quite often what's happening with the posters that some of them, I've seen 1 or 2 examples, things outside churches, we've lost 3 of those words and we've gone just straight on the safe and the messaging, the very important practical functional messaging, and we've forgotten that we need to surround this in the warmth of delight. We're delighted, we're glad that you're coming, you know, all of those things are really important. And then, as you say, using ordinary words, but not being afraid sometimes to reclaim God language. So the word bless is an interesting one. So we just put out a video about 3 simple things people could do for bereaved people in their neighbourhood or anywhere. And the 3 words we used were contact, listen, bless. And bless is a really good transitional word for people because it's actually a faith word. It's also a familiar word for people to understand those little things that people can do, those acts of kindness and generosity towards people. And again, we've produced a prayer card that you can easily give to a family at the moment. Loving God bless my family. This is the starting point for people, the little seed, and it doesn't matter where they are on this journey, just like saying this is something you can start with. Being confident enough to do that is really important, I think.
A church near me in Norwich had all the way along the front of their church during the lockdown, they had bunting that you could add to, so you could make your little square or triangle, and it was about hope. So it was just people writing about hope, and again, that's another it's a faith word, but it's something that people can kind of connect with, and that felt really relevant for this time. And I think that's been so interesting, watching some people using outdoor space, because obviously it's kind of forced us outside. We were incredibly lucky, weren't we, that the weather was so great during most of lockdown, so people's exercise and people's kind of short bits of time outside of the house, that they were able to use that pleasantly, as it were. And I think it was some pioneers I know sort of hanging gift tags on a tree and saying, you know, write your prayer here, or kind of take this away, and do you need hope right now? Do you need peace? Do you need? And so people were taking things away from the end of the Pioneers Drive and things like that. So I think there's some ways we, you know, that's that thing about putting the church in the context of people's lives, isn't it? Giving them a sense of an experience that goes, oh, okay, maybe the church isn't somewhere to be frightened of, or maybe it's not always just like Dot in EastEnders, or, you know, some of the other Christians that they see on the screen sometimes. That's very dated reference, isn't it? That I'm not really into EastEnders anymore. But anyway.
I think it's about almost being permissive rather than prohibitive. That so often, and Benita talked to you about the fear that people have around church, and it's because we've sort of got a legacy of being prohibited, and we don't even realise that we do it, and it's there in a lot of our notices and our messaging in the physical buildings, and unintentionally it might even creep in a digital way. We have to be permissive and enabling and say, well, you're welcome, you can do this, it's okay. And for me, one of the most important things when we think about this context that we're encountering people, especially at the moment, the ones that are dropping in on our digital services and so on, is that sense of doing the same things. I've been thinking a lot about this, how we do the same things that we have been talking about when we welcome people in the physical world, and how we look at how those things will translate. So one of the first things we talk about is just noticing people. We drew a lot on the story of Zacchaeus, and I like that story because one of the things to think about with that is Zacchaeus makes himself uncomfortable to do this. He's not doing the familiar thing. He's gone up a blooming tree, and unless he's some sort of latent tree climber, he's put himself out to do this. And Jesus sees him in that position. And I think even when, you know, people do their little thumbs up sign when they're watching on Facebook Live or whatever, we almost need people to be noticing that and saying, oh, hi, great to see you. Just doing those little noticing activities that draw people on, and making sure we give them practical things like good information, not just at the end when they've dropped out, but all the time, all the way through. This is what else you could do. This is where else you could find us. We talk about inviting people not back to things, but inviting people on to that faith journey. And we just need to be a little bit more intentional about that contact and invitation process with people, however we meet them, so that they build up that bank of, oh yeah, this is a relationship, these are people who are interested in me.
Yeah. And that's the hospitality, isn't it? I think that Benita's picked up on so well. And I think that's the sense of when you welcome somebody in to your home, there are certain things that you don't do, as in you if you want them to feel relaxed, you don't sort of insist that they take all their clothes off or, you know, take their shoes. You know, you might ask the way you ask people to do that, you know, you don't make them feel awkward, make them feel like they're kind of bringing dirt into your home kind of thing. And I just think that there are certain ways, you know, particularly around a sort of dinner party, for example, you invite people round for supper, and I think in our culture, people want to help clear the table, they want to load the dishwasher with you, help put on the coffee or bring things through, be helpful, be part of it. And I think if we do that whole, oh no, you're the guest, you sit there, and then, you know, we do all of that, and it becomes really awkward, and you just don't feel like you're part of the family or part of the enjoyment of it, whereas it becomes a bit performance based. And I think there's something really key in kind of allowing people into the space of what you know, what we're doing, rather than it being too much of a performance. And I think that that's the way that we can do that with the online, is, as you say, I think picking up on comments that people have made, and also saying, we're now doing this bit, you don't have to close your eyes, for example. You can send out little prompts to people, exactly as you've said, just to make that atmosphere feel like a warm, hospitable place, you know.
And I think that thing about participating and being active rather than passive is really important. A lot of perceptions about the church, and sort of Benita slightly touched on this as well, is that we are going to do to people.
Yeah.
So coming to us is a passive experience, and we can talk a lot about co-creating. That's a posh way of thinking about it. You know, it's just getting involved, really. And we don't need to wait until people are, you know, obviously on a faith journey to get them helping. And we found in the research, particularly with the non-church wedding couples, that helping was a great thing. So there was one story about a church that stood up, did a classic thing in the notices we've all done, talked about the church fete, you know, and if you want to help with the church fete, go and talk to whoever at the end of the service. So this young couple travelling 80 miles to be there on their 4th visit or whatever, they go up to this lady at the end to say, and they wanted to help, and they said, well, we could help you with a bookstall. And she said it with the best will in the world. She said, oh, we didn't mean you. Oh no. Yeah, we didn't mean you. But actually, they did want to be involved, because she thought she was doing, as you said, don't help with the wash up. She was doing that. Oh, you know, you're a guest, don't help. But to be feeling included, which is what this faith journey is all about, that you're coming into that journey and feeling that you belong on that journey, you need to start doing some things. For a lot of people, the doing of things is really important. Yeah. And that's good old-fashioned things, which obviously we're not doing at the moment, about being alongside someone, having those conversations, the practical task. And as Benita said, listening out for the little clues to read what's going on for people is really special. So just saying, so it might be helping with your tech, you know, right now. It could be that one of the people that joins in is the person who could really help you do some things you're not so sure about. So just saying, do anybody want to help us with this? And letting them get involved is really important.
I think that my observation would be that culture of wanting to get stuck in and involved and not feel like you're waiting to be invited in, I think that's more prominent outside of the church, actually. And I think probably within the church we've got into that mindset of thinking we need to be invited to help with this, or you know, so I do think that's a sort of listening to culture thing, isn't it, about those that are outside of the church. And I think in these kind of coronavirus times, there's going to be a lot more needed of that, because I think people's assumptions are shifting. I've been doing a bit of work, and I'll be talking a bit more about this in a forthcoming webinar, but trying to capture some of the learning from this, you know, these strangest of times. And one of the things that's particularly come out of that is that people are valuing local, but they're valuing relationships in a way that perhaps they hadn't before. That something has shifted, whether or not it will be become a permanent shift remains to be seen, because it's quite early days, of course. But one of the things that seems to be shifting is away from being an individual or a family unit that happens to locate their house in a certain place and go and do what they want to do. There's much more connection with their community, and that kind of, those bonds have been recognised in a new way, or re-understood, I suppose. So whether that sticks is an interesting question, but I do think that if we're talking about, as Benita says, you know, being intentional, then it's listening to that and trying to think about what might we as a church do to create those bonds. So it's perhaps, you know, hosting a socially distant barbecue on the church hall lawn, or on the park. You know, it doesn't have to be in the church, does it? You know, or kind of organising a family walk that could happen now as long as we were adhering to all those kind of social distancing things. So some of it's, I think, not necessarily hoping for the best, but actually being intentional about, because that's really fertile ground, isn't it? If people are committing in a different way now to wanting those community connections, that wanting those relationships, that's quite fertile ground.
Yes, and that's that hospitality again, that sense of it's love that will sustain them in this moment, and through that we can begin to hear and listen to the questions that we can respond to with messages of, you know, the hope and so on that we offer. And I think it's also that thing that Benita was saying about making positive memories for people is really important. I guess what we've learned in a lot of our research is, and the last phrase I think Benita used was be patient, is a lot of this takes much longer than we think, and a lot of what we're doing is breaking ground for people, making it possible for something else to happen, not next week, not even next year, but we learn sometimes it takes a few years, a few encounters for things to really grow. Of course, it's fantastic when we meet those people at the exact point where they're really ready to engage with a faith journey, and that might happen, and we have to be ready to have those conversations. But also we just need to value what we do as being something that is contributing to just breaking the ground and giving people who may have no other contact ever with church a positive memory of, gosh, you know, oh, it was really good when the church did that. I saw just today someone who's got a really nice, almost like a nature walk in their churchyard, but they've sort of put nice psalm texts up as well. And why not take a moment to think about, you know, using that sense of, gosh, you can go out with a walk, whether you're adult, whether you're with your children, and use this space to not only notice creation, but then use that experience to think and think about your faith and where you are in life. So really, really good opportunities for people to be, as you said, lots of wonderful creative things that people can do. And that process of contacting and connecting is really, really important. When we did the work around welcome last year, we talked about see, smile, say hello, and in the end that's what we're doing, building that relationship and being confident enough to make that contact and sustain that contact. We're not very good always at confidently sustaining contact with people as a church. We give up, you know, quite quickly, but if we sustain it, eventually we find it's much more likely that people will know who we are and remember and come back.
Well, actually, I was going to say, I think one of the really key areas that can be achieved is actually in a toddler group, isn't it? In the sense of the relationships and being functionally good at it, as it were, as Benita pointed out, but also offering that warmth and hospitality. And I think if I think about our colleague Mary Hawes, who's looked at the toddler group research that she's done, and some of that about being really intentional about people expect a church hall toddler group to have some church elements in it.
Yes.
But equally that they need that warmth, that relationship to kind of grow. And actually I think that's the other challenge, and probably from Benita's work and also Mary's work, is that actually childhood is the key time. So I think I was guilty of this in parishes and in my pioneer work, of sometimes thinking that toddler group was all about the adult's faith journey, but remembering that actually it could be part of the children's faith journey as well. So there's some lovely resources like Diddy Disciples now, and you know, some of that sort of toddler church, the idea that it isn't just about the adults, and it can be that those children's memories, those positive engagements that the tiny children get, not just what their parents or their carers get when they're with us.
And also, because as Benita said, this is a lifetime, although it might feel to us like people who've been at a toddler group, you know, it all drops away, they get to school, they go to secondary school, it all falls away. Because they've got something positive in early childhood, there do come moments later on whether it's they're thinking about getting married, whether they've got their own children, whether they lose someone, whether just life is what life is, they meet a different person from church. That early foundation, that memory, that sense of something good having been in their lives will come back into play. So it's got a value in itself for just giving people that sort of bedrock of a sense that we have done something that's reflected God's love and hope into their lives at that moment.
We could carry on because this is great stuff, but I'm aware of the time, so I'm wondering if we should bring Benita back in and see what the kind of questions that are coming in and be able to offer some of our opinions.
Thank you very much indeed to all three of you, the disembodied voice here to ask you some questions. We've got Benita back with us now. First question is over to Sandra. How can we make people feel that they are welcome to go into a church? For instance, some people will regularly visit family graves, but are still nervous to go inside the building.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question, and Benita touched on that the church feels like a place of that you're forbidden, that you cannot be yourself in, that maybe when you get in there you have to behave differently from how you are, and you might be judged in there. And in some ways, again, it's about just not worry. I think I've learned to not worry too much about what people are doing at the stage they're at. So actually value the time they spend outside. And for example, I know of one vicar who's now doing she's doing sort of remembering services outside in the graveyard, and she tried desperately to move this service into the church, and people didn't come. They wouldn't come and go into church. But when she kept it outside, she's now got regularly between 12 and 20 plus people coming on a little kind of mini pilgrimage around the churchyard, thinking about their loved ones, but about loss in general. So respecting the space where people are and not being too anxious. And it's a bit, I feel like that now about communion, actually. I used to be terribly, terribly anxious at the altar, and I was practically using, my mind power to make people come up to the altar and say, come up, it's all right, we're kind, we're lovely. And they wouldn't come out their seats. And now I don't worry about it. I just think, well, when I first do something, I quite often just want to be on the edges for a bit and just let it happen. And then over time, work out how you can do that, looking at, the open door, literally, and what does your signage around your door say? I went to a little rural church near Christmas time. I was taking the service, and every single sign that was in the porch was about bad things happening. Not a single sign said, we're delighted that you're at this church today. It was about, don't steal our roof, don't steal this, this is what we do, this is, how much money we need to keep going. Everything was all about that. There was no warm message that you're welcome to just come into this space. So thinking about that can help as well.
Thank you very much. We've got nearly 300 people with us at the moment, and they're from all over. I was going to say all over the country, but you know what? We've got people from the Isle of Wight, from Greece, from Australia, but Hereford, Nottinghamshire, Essex. And one of the things that's come up is the use of video conferencing, most commonly Zoom, and the use of that for things like alpha courses. And a question for Heather: the way that we can connect with people now is extraordinary, and we can do so all across the country and across the world. But have you got any thoughts on discipling people after a Zoom alpha?
Okay. I've spoken to quite a lot of people who found that their inquirers courses are kind of really coming good at this time, and doing it via Zoom or other platforms is really working. So I'd encourage you to get on with that. I'd also encourage you to look at some other resources that perhaps aren't alpha. There's a great resource called Puzzling Questions, and it's based on some research that was done by a university about what are the spiritual questions people are asking, and then somebody they narrowed it down to 6 big questions. So things like what's God like, how does the spiritual zone impact on me? How can I be happy? What happens when I die? Big questions. And then someone designed a course around those questions. So it feels to me like when I was doing pioneer work, actually things like puzzling questions are the ones to do right early on, are the ones that might engage, in terms of that really early engagement, whereas alpha becomes more perhaps about how to believe in the Christian faith and kind of teaching the faith a little bit more. So sometimes asking those kind of big questions in a different way might help. I think discipleship is all about relationship, isn't it? So for many churches, it's about one-on-one or small groups, and again, that's quite easy to facilitate with Zoom. You can use the small group function. So if you did it as a larger thing and then sent people into different groups, just encouraging people to get on the phone and to chat to one another or now I suppose we can have a socially distanced chat in the park or whatever. I think it's seeing discipleship as relationship, and also I think as taking part. So one of the things I always felt with the pioneer work that I did, which was teaching people to pray, whether or not they believed in God. So in the sense of not starting with, okay, well, once you now believe in God, then we'll start the praying. Because as Benita already said today, actually, was it 51%, Benita, I think you said, didn't you, pray? So how can we help people pray? And there are more than one way to pray, and how do we encourage them to know that their way isn't wrong? It's just different, and that you can pray out loud, you can pray in quiet, you can pray in the garden, you can pray with your eyes shut, all of that stuff. And I think for me, the experience I had with one of the people that was doing my toddler group with me, talking to toddler groups again, and we offered a woman who was on in the toddler groups that we would put her son on our prayer list because he was doing going down for an operation, and she said, "Oh, I'm not very religious. I'm not sure I do this praying stuff." And the woman who I'd been working with and teaching about prayer, and she went, "Oh, I'm not really religious either, but I do this praying, and it seems to work." And I think that's that engagement, isn't it, that people are doing. So I think it's not being afraid to get people doing, not necessarily believing or thinking the right things. Get them doing, get them engaged. And then that way, I think that's a discipleship thing. But relationships are key, and doing, I would say.
Thank you so much. It's really incredibly useful. We've got our next question here, which is perhaps for Sandra, perhaps for Benita, or a mix. Benita, your research is extremely interesting, and we're getting a lot of questions asking whether it's been published or how it can be accessed. Are either of you able to give any sort of signposting or thoughts on that at all?
There are various presentations that have been made public. I think they're found on your website, your church support hub. I believe. There was the conference we had on From Stranger to Friend. I talked about faith journeys, and that is available on there. A transcript, a longer version of what I gave today, with the transcript and everything is on there. But no, nothing's published. I haven't written anything as such.
No,
People have asked me many times, will I write a book on it? And I've always,
our next thing to think about.
Yes, I've always said, no, I haven't written any of it up formally, no.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll make sure that we've got links sent out to the Church Support Hub. But for those of you that are ready, it's churchsupporthub.org, and we'll do some signposting to that post-conference. Heather, as a priest who is very much pioneer, someone here is saying they are familiar with all that has been said. However, they don't see people coming back to church or making steps into the church, despite the hospitality, the childcare. They do all this, they ask people at baptisms and at funerals, and they appreciate that they need to listen to context. But this does not seem to make a worshipping congregation. Any further ideas to actually draw people into our church family and to nurture their faith and help them on their faith journey?
Yes. start a fresh expression. I think for me, that key in that question is about getting them back into the church, and I think we've got to kind of get to a point of understanding that we live in a mixed economy of church. There are different ways of being church under the Anglican in the Anglican family, and really that's about trying to create new forms of church that are connecting with different cultures. However, I think what people have understood about the mixed economy before was that you were either doing fresh expressions or you were doing mainstream church. And I think that we've got to a point now where actually you can have a mixed economy in your parish, in your benefice. You know, you can have lots of different forms and expressions of church coming together. So therefore, one of the things I would say is think about those that you are making those connections with, where the fertile ground has been, or where if you like, you've been intentionally fertilizing the ground with those, and see what it is that would connect them. Is it that it is mainly baptism families that you're kind of, you know, engaging with in that way, or do you have a lot of weddings, or, you know, different, what is it in your parish? Having a think about who are the people and the communities and the different networks in your area, because then I think if you're starting with that, then you're going to think, okay, what would make sense in this culture, in this space, and sort of understanding that actually you're not giving up on mainstream church, but equally you're recognizing that mainstream church isn't going to fit for everybody. And so that's what I would say. I would also put a massive plug in for my next webinar, which is coming up, which is talking about coming out of lockdown with a new mission initiative, and we're going to be talking about how you might go about starting a fresh expression. So that will be one to tune in for if you feel like you're doing all of that intentional hospitality and the kind of creating that fertile ground. So let's think together about how you can go on in that fresh expressions journey, because what we now know is you don't have to be an expert to do that, because we've got the wisdom of fresh expressions over the past 20 years that we can draw on. So it's kind of, and also part of our greenhouse project is about helping people just have a go at starting a fresh expression.
And again, Heather, I think it's also that thing about what might be church for people on this journey that might take a long time. So it might be, let's take your baptism family, it just might be that the thing for them that is working and is really doing a lot of things is the toddler group. Mm-hmm. It is the toddler group, and so therefore you have to look at what the toddler group could become for people, and how does that work for them, and where do they go from that. And it might not be a year, remember, it might not be 2 years, it might be 5 years, but really importantly in all that is the keeping in contact with people through all that journey. Yeah. So very commonly with toddler stuff, for example, is we stop being in touch with people when they go to school. We stop. I can't stress how important it is that we're in contact with people and just acknowledging where life is taking them, because then you've got that possibility of them flourishing into whatever it is that you're starting. And the other thing I'll just mention at the moment, because I think for a lot of churches it's going to be important, is thinking through where you're going to be doing bereavement support going forward. It's going to be a really big space that we could be in going forward. And we'll put another website up called Lost on Hope, where we're resourcing churches to think about how you could offer that bit of support as a connection at this moment to people, not the ones we've done funerals for, but just the bereaved people that are in our communities. And it's another place where people often ask those big faith questions as well, if we're listening.
Related to that, I would say, you know, doing church where you already have the connections with people. You know, thinking about the toddler research I did with Mary Halls. The church was happening there, and they talked about that as their toddler church. I never forget this one where they were, as part of the toddler group, they all went into a traditional church, and I was sitting in the pews with the parents or carers or whatever, and the toddlers all went up to the church rail and had a blessing, right? And there was quite a traditional little address, and they all went back again, and that was their favourite part of the service. And it was traditional church within a toddler group, and there was a National Childbirth Trust, a group going on at the same time, and whenever they coincided and they knew the blessing was going on, they'd all come in and bring their children up to their babies up to the altar rail to have the blessing. So, you know, take church to where you have the connections, where you're in that dynamic context of people's lives, do church.
Thank you so much. It's really, really useful, and actually something that's come out of that answers a question that has come up here, which was regarding with toddler groups likely to be one of the last things that are reinstated, with social distancing, you know, almost impossible with under threes. Many groups we're reading here maybe not back until January or even Easter 2021. This is from, you know, attendees today and the discussions they're having within their own churches, and talking about how that they can maintain relationships with families over that long period of time. Sandra, you touched on it, and Benita, you sort of talked about some stuff there around sort of, you know, some physical options as well. But can any of our panel today just give some insight into how to maintain those relationships during that continued time of social distancing, particularly with the under threes group?
It's not actually very easy to maintain relationships with the actual toddlers, but definitely their parents. My mum's church is a great example of this, where they'd started a baby group almost a month before lockdown happened, and actually were doing, you know, bog standard, as it were, really good quality, time for the children to play, and then a song time at the end. And so the curate who's running that has been continuing to record herself leading the songs at the beginning. And so, and then they've got a WhatsApp group where the mums, where Sian will share the video, and then the mums say, "Oh, Archie recognised your voice. He went mad when you sang Wiggles and Woggles," or whatever it is. And so they've got that kind of ongoing space to have conversations at that particular time. It's a very simple way. If you've got their contact details, you have to obviously be careful about GDPR there, and invite them into the WhatsApp group rather than assuming they want to be part of it. So just be careful about that. But I think for many people, those kind of threads, those kind of groups are actually really, really nice ways for people to feel like they're still in relationship with you. You're not exactly discipling them at that particular point, of course, but equally there's no reason why you can't offer a prayer, or say, you know, if any of you would like me to pray for anybody in your family or anything that's going on for you, drop me a message separately and I'll do that. So again, you're still building those intentional relationships about God being a part of your life, and therefore, you know, an offer to them. So I'd say some of those kind of things, thinking about ways to stay connected using social media.
I'll put this book title up later as well. There's a book that I've been quite influenced by called The Power of Moments. It's not a religious or theological book, and by Chip Heath and Dan Heath. And it says such interesting things about how the little things we do elevate something out of the run of the mill. And we don't realise this, but the card that you send because you've remembered it's a toddler's birthday, or a significant anniversary that falls through the letterbox, is really important in continuing that relationship until the time that you can meet again in person, supplemented by all the digital and online things you can do. But there's something about those little physical things. And because we know from our research, sadly, that people's expectation of church and what we'll do is so low, whenever we do anything that exceeds that expectation, so with your wedding couples that you've got in the process already, perhaps, you know, the fact that you might send them a card now to say, we know this is all still uncertain, but we're really looking forward to talking to you about this, just is out of the run of the mill. It's not what they expect you to do. So when you do it, it really elevates the whole sense of connection that you've got, that you can build on going forward. So having the will to keep in touch is really important, and then using all the different approaches that we can to do that, and just be confident enough to do it, knowing that some of it just falls. Not every single. Sometimes in the church we seem to think if we send one card it means one person will come to church, which isn't how it works at all. It might take a long time, but nurturing that relationship. I'd also say, in terms of people's discipleship and faith journey, not only pray for them, but actually enabling them to pray. So even though it's so simple, but a fridge magnet, a card that says, loving God, bless my family today, is a way of saying to that family, you too can pray. You're on this journey. Or, you know, here's a little snippet of a story from the Bible. Just, they can do this too. It's not just passively, we know it all and they don't know anything. And be prepared to be changed by our interactions with people as well, because it's two-way, this hospitality. When we call it stranger to friend, we think straight away, oh, we're the friends, they're the strangers. But of course, it's the other way around as well. We're the strangers. So how do we get changed into friends with those people? So just being prepared in all of that. I guess, Tom, we're running out of time.
You have predicted exactly what I was going to say next. So we are a little over, and I'm aware that folks will need to depart for other Zoom sessions, doubtfully. So I wondered if there was time just for one last thought, and then maybe we could close with prayer, as is right and tradition. But I just wanted to feedback something that came in actually while you were speaking there, Heather, and a lovely piece of feedback here from somebody who is attending today's webinar and saying that they found a way of staying in touch with the toddlers that have been coming to their church prior to lockdown, and they're actually doing a Tots worship group on Zoom every week, and they send out the theme and the craft at the weekend, and then they have a show and tell and weekly songs and stories and prayers. And it leads me on to the point that I just wanted to sort of close out with here and see what thoughts you had, which were that we're thinking about welcome without spending money, because many churches at the moment are facing real austerity and troubling times financially, and so many things can be very expensive. And just wondering, any final thoughts that the panel have on things that aren't expensive or indeed free, and whether you can suggest some ideas about opening the church in a welcoming way, whether that be digitally or in any other format. That would be lovely. And then I'll say goodbye and leave you to close in prayer.
I was thinking, actually, the first thing that came to mind, Tom, is making stuff visually engaging is really nice. You know, it's going back to Sandra's point about the high street, and I went out for an eye test the other day, and they all the signs about, you know, really brightly coloured, lots of rainbows, you know, all of that sort of thing. A free thing that I use a lot is a website called Canva, C-A-N-V-A. You can sign up for a free account and you can design posters on there, and there's loads of free photos, loads of free icons. You can do all sorts of things with it, and it's really lovely. You can use templates as well. So if you're thinking about signage in your church, and as Sandra said, there's lots of stuff that we need to tell people about where to sit and where not to sit and all of the rest of it. But if you can do that in a really engaging way and lively and make that fun and colourful, then that's going to help a little bit in terms of the language people are kind of wanting to look at, you know, wanting to communicate in. And I think Sandra's point about how you say, what words are you using? And there's loads of different churches, I think, who have shared lots of their own work about, you know, how, you know, some welcome signs. So do a little bit of research. If you're kind of struggling to think, how should we say this? Have a little bit of a Google and look at different ways people have done it, because then you can make it yours with your logo or your colours or whatever you want. But it just means that when people come in, they're not kind of confronted with signs that are all about, you know, you're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. It's the welcome and the delight that comes first. And then my final point would be, just think about the words you're using, because up until I was ordained, practically, I didn't know what a nave was, or all sorts of different things. So you have to be clear about what you're meaning, because actually, if you say no one's allowed in the nave and then people wander in, that might be because they don't know what a nave is. So just think about the language as well.
I would just say the simplest thing and freest thing that we can all do is smile. So that involves, a lot of us can be walking around in our communities now, and those who are able to wear some kind of uniform that indicates they're from the church can be smiley people in the community. And that's really, really important. But all of us, lay and ordained, can be smiley people in our community. And it's having that attitude of smile in anything we we do, that doesn't cost anything. So if you have got people, and you will have a volunteer in church, just brief them on smiling. Doesn't cost anything, it's free, and it suggests so much to people. But and on the posters, although that's great, that website, there's also, we released on Friday 2 posters that
sorry Sandra,
it doesn't matter, that just has they've got prayers on as well, really simple prayers. You do this, you know, take a picture of your QR code and it pops up with 2 prayers, and it also lets people light a candle online. So again, they say welcome, you are very welcome here, you know. And then coming soon there'll be some more available when we actually can open up a little bit more. So nationally we produce some things, and you can also produce things locally as well. Those posters are free to download as A4 posters. You don't do that, or if you need to order them bigger sizes, you can order them as big as you want, and you pay postage and packing. But the actual posters printed are free. So we'll put the link up for those as well. But have that attitude of smile wherever you go, that says, oh, you know, I'm glad this is happening. I think sometimes I get so depressed by the negative attitudes that we seem to have sometimes as a church about the fact that people are going to come, or that we're surprised that people who don't already come might come. So finding ourselves that warmth that says we're glad that you're going to be able to be with us, and keeping that online as well is really important. So I guess that brings us to
one of the exciting things at the moment about being in lockdown is that so much is happening in the home. Church is at home now, and the toddler group activities can be at home. Everything can happen in the home. And I think about one of the greatest toddler groups I went to, where they were doing the story of the widow's mite. And all the toddlers they'd done the story, and all the toddlers were given the chocolate buttons, and they had to decide whether to eat the chocolate buttons, or how many they could give away to friends with and decorate them. And that's just something that can happen at home. We can do those sorts of activities in the home, and get church and toddler and faith nurture going in the home during lockdown much more than we ever could without lockdown, and that's exciting.
Oh, this has been such a useful and really interesting chat, so thank you both, and thank you especially Benita for coming and presenting your work for us. Thanks. So Sandra, we're going to end in prayer, aren't we? And this is a prayer that I came across, written by John and Olive Drain, who are pioneers themselves and have been for a long time. So we'll use this prayer as we end. Let us dream of a church committed to using all media platforms to share the message of God's great love, creating spaces where all those who engaged are assured that they are valued and known by name.
In which Jesus is at the centre, our window onto God's own heart, the sign of God's hope and design for all humankind. In which the Spirit is not a party symbol, but wind and fire in everyone, gracing the church with a kaleidoscope of gifts and constant renewal for all.
A church in which worship is lively and fun, as well as reverent and holy. People know how to pray and enjoy it frequently and regularly, individually and together, in silence, in word, in symbol, song and movement, through tablet and phone, as well as physical presence.
A church which affirms life over death as much as life after death, unafraid of change, able to recognise God's hand in the revolutions, celebrating the beauty of diversity, rejecting the imprisonment of uniformity, concerned about love in all relationships, denying the separation between secular and sacred, digital and analogue, church and culture, since all these are part of the world Christ came to and died for.
A church without the answers, but asking the right questions, while always pointing to the glorious mystery who is God. So deeply rooted in both gospel and tradition that, like a living algorithm, it can search all platforms and continually surprise us with new connections.
Let us dream of a church that reaches out across the world in peace and partnership, podcasting your wonders and your word, sharing images of grace on Instagram, emailing encouragement to friends, creating spaces of generosity on Facebook, and tweeting truth and goodness. zooming into new spaces that challenge inherited assumptions, rediscovering the power of a ministering community rather than a community gathered around a minister.
Let us dream of a church so embedded in the digital world that it would be really missed if no longer online, whose websites ooze with possibilities of a world renewed, with videos that inspire, blogs that include, and games that nurture the soul, where there is a wild sharing of ideas and much rejoicing when they go viral, but with little concern for success, statistics, growth, or even survival. A church so full of good news that its online presence becomes an outpost of the kingdom, bringing peace and healing to a tortured world, prophetically confronting the forces of evil and sustaining digital networks in which we all find embrace, acceptance, and affirmation.
And finally, let us dream of a people called to recognise our own absurdities, including the absurdity that is love, serious about the call and the mission, but not very much about ourselves, singing, laughing, crying as we forget our passwords and lose our connections, but recognising that in every world we might yet come to inhabit, you are already there ahead of us.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate that many of you may well have had to disappear already because we have gone over time, but I hope you've enjoyed hearing our discussions and our thoughts. So just a couple of things to draw your attention to. The webinar that I spoke about is on the 15th of July, and that's coming out of lockdown with a new mission initiative, and that's with myself and a number of other pioneers and thinkers. And then we've got a date, but not yet a title for the next life events webinar through the E&D stream, and that's going to be on the 7th of July, and thinking about relationship building with wedding couples and baptism families. And then finally, there is, as we had at the beginning, the life events diary webinars, which are also coming up on those dates on your screen. So you can go to the lifeeventsdiary.org/webinars, and then for the C of E, we've got that short URL there for you to go and book in for your next webinars with us. We've really enjoyed your questions, and thank you for your engagement, and we will be posting the links to all of the resources that we've mentioned, especially things like the Church Support Hub and all of the other resources we've linked to, and we'll also share the link to the prayer at the end as well, which I hope you enjoyed as much and found inspiring as much as I did. And all it reminds for us to say, I think, Sandra, is goodbye. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.